Hello, I'm Royal Orr. Welcome to the seventh in our eight-part Epiphany series, inviting people in the United Church of Canada to think about not only our past 100 years, but the century to come. 2025 is the year when we will mark the foundation of the United Church of Canada sometime in June, and we know there's lots of celebrations coming together around that. We'll actually catch up with Brian Arthur Brown a little bit later when he anchors this piece and just see what the latest is on those clusters coming together. Today, we want to do a bit of a focus on the Indigenous Church. And by that, I simply mean that I think everybody or most people in the United Church, because of the remit and reporting on this, know that we are in the process in the United Church of trying to find a structure which will be respectful of the presence of Indigenous peoples and respectful of their need to control their future within the church. And so we're going to be taking a look at that. And we have the great fortune to have the moderator with us today to talk about that, Carmen Lansdowne. But we also have Parker MacCarthy with us, who's a recently retired judge in the BC Provincial Court, who has quite a bit of experience with how the BC court system has tried to do something a little bit similar to what we have been doing for the last while with the Indigenous Church. So that's the lineup. First the moderator, then Parker MacCarthy, and then Brian Brown coming at the end. And I will start with Carmen Lansdowne. What a great pleasure it is to meet you online.
Happy to be here.
Okay, great. Now, I think most people in the church, and for those who are watching who maybe don't know, Carmen has this extraordinary background in terms of, academics and social justice leadership in BC, primarily with First United and other important United Church institutions in BC. She is a member of the Haltsuk Nation, which is concentrated in that part of the coast of BC near Bella Bella. And she was, when elected as moderator, the first Indigenous woman to lead our church. So, Carmen, before we jump into the Indigenous Church and the update there, first of all, how's it been being moderator of the United Church of Canada?
First of all, it's been a huge privilege and a huge honor to get to know our church in such an intimate and yet national way. Um, there's been some changes in terms of my role and how I relate to the work of the regions and the local communities of faith since the restructuring. And I don't mean just the sort of legal restructuring of the courts of the church, but also the restructuring that's happened to society since COVID. Um, of course, I was elected in 2022, and we were still measuring like waves of COVID at that time, and a lot of the regional staff and leadership at the local communities of faith level were very tired of the constant pivoting and having to keep up on all of the health guidelines and everything around COVID. And so one of the pieces of feedback given to the chair of my advisory committee was like, please don't make us plan immersion trips for the moderator at this time. And so in some ways, I've been very free to accept invitations. And Graham Brownmiller, the Reverend Graham Brownmiller from Jubilee United Church in Burnaby, BC, is the chair of my advisory committee. He and my colleague Carol and I have tried to, really balance my time across different regions. Some regions I've had a lot of invitations, and some regions I've had much fewer invitations. But we have tried to make sure that I've had a presence across the different regions of the church. And a lot of those visits have been like a little bit of like the moderator show where I show up and I do something like my flourishing workshop, or I'm a keynote at a regional council meeting or some other conference. And then I don't get the chance to really do the type of tours of the local ministries that previous moderators have done. And so that's one piece of feedback that we've given to the review task group that is looking at the roles of the moderator and the general secretary, is just that like maybe there needs to be some compromise, and that, I could have the chance to listen more at the local level than I've had the ability to. I've done
Right.
lots of talking, less listening, which is uncomfortable.
Well, okay. So I think one of the things people in the church would identify with your moderatorship, I guess that's a word, your time as
Sure.
moderator,
Yeah.
is the strategic plan that came out.
Yeah.
And the cut line, which has been adopted, I think, pretty widely, deep spirituality, bold discipleship, daring justice. Could you maybe just talk a little bit about that slogan and how that has informed your work as moderator, or how you're seeing it develop within the wider church?
Yeah, so I think that again, that's another change that happened just before I started my term as moderator with the adoption of the strategic plan. And the strategic plan is really for the general counsel office to make sure that the staff and financial resources of the general counsel offices are like used to the highest and best use. And the call and vision part of the strategic plan, so like the big North Star, I mean, our ultimate North Star is Jesus, but the so the secondary big North Star is the call and vision. And that's where those words to the call to be a church of deep spirituality, bold discipleship, and daring justice come from. And I think that more and more, the hope is that the moderator will be an ambassador for that call and vision. And what I love about it is that I think those 6 words incorporate so much of what it means to be Christian and what it means to be church. But they're so broad that every local ministry can really rumble with them and say, well, what's uniquely ours to do as a church of deep spirituality, bold discipleship, and daring justice?
So
Because every, just like nobody is going to see the world the way that I see the world, or nobody's going to see the world the way Parker sees the world. Um, or, but we have our own gifts and strengths to bring to our vocations, and individual communities of faith are like that too. Like Islington United Church is very different here in Etobicoke from Jubilee United Church in Burnaby, and they each have their own ministries to do, but they can still be churches of deep spirituality, bold discipleship, and daring justice. And I think that was such a brilliant way and a widely consulted way to express who we are, and without the sort of fibers binding us together of presbyteries, I feel like that call and vision can be the thing that unites us as a united church.
okay, so using that framework
Yeah.
and keeping the North Star, which you remind us is Jesus, for Um, can we maybe turn to what I know is not an easy topic right now, and that is what's
Mhm.
happening with the indigenous church? And so
Yeah.
again, well, like without pushing you in any direction you don't want to go, can you give us your perspective on where things are right now in this church that's trying to be deeply spiritual, bold disciples, and doing daring justice, but is trying to figure out how to do it with respect to
Mhm.
the indigenous church?
Yeah. So that is a tough one. We have as a church, we authorized Remit 1 and enacted Remit 1 at the October General Council meeting, which was basically a remit to end remits for the Indigenous church, to say that actually, if the Indigenous church wants to structure itself a certain way, it doesn't need to do any category of remit, because that's part of our commitment to reconciliation, which I actually think was a pretty brilliant move in terms of governance. Um, One of the things that's happened since the restructuring, well, if we go back to the comprehensive review process, one thing I will say is that I don't think the work to engage Indigenous communities of faith was as intentional or as widespread as it could have been. There was conflict between the Indigenous Church and the Comprehensive Review Task Group um, before they made the proposal for how to restructure the church. And presentations about the restructuring of the church were not made to Indigenous communities of faith. And there's a whole hard story about the reality of that. But basically, the Indigenous church would have been deeply opposed to the elimination of presbyteries. And without the consultation, it really felt like a church the decision made, and just sort of it Keewatin Presbytery was probably our most functional presbytery, and it was trilingual in 3 languages, 3 Indigenous languages. And then when Keewatin Presbytery asked, can we still continue to have Keewatin Presbytery, the answer that they were told at the time was no. And so the restructuring of the church really broke the heart of the Indigenous church, and the National Indigenous Council became sort of like this national region of the church, but has the same or fewer resources as the other regions of the church, but has a national scope and so is like deeply under-resourced compared to the rest of the church. And
Mm.
what happens when we become under-resourced is we start fighting about things. We start fighting about leadership, about governance, about money. And so there were already some conflicts kind of brewing in the church that came out of both a frustration about the restructuring of the church to begin with, and then about how ministries are staffed, resources, where money goes. And those are not conditions that were created by Indigenous people in the church, right? That's a consequence of continuing to have the church operate in a way that centers the non-Indigenous church's way of being. And so two things were happening at once. The legal counsel and the general secretary were trying to provide a pathway forward that really decolonized governance for the Indigenous church. And all of these other conflicts that were coming up as a result of the fact that the national church had made, or that the whole United Church had made decisions that really deeply impacted and broke the Indigenous church in a lot of ways, happened at the same time. And then um, we had a proposal that came from some Indigenous commissioners to the General Council in October that was received after the agenda was released. And I made the decision, along with the General Secretary as moderator, to say, well, it's going to look and feel awful if we say, no, we're not going to deal with this because you missed the deadline. And so let's deal with it. But we also misunderstood the intent of the proposal because we hadn't had time to be in conversation with folks. And then that all kind of played out publicly, and it looked like we were trying to shut down the people who were upset. And in the meantime, like, there's actual real conflicts that are happening in the Indigenous church. What I will say is that the National Indigenous Elders Council has been really outstanding in holding their roles as elders culturally, but also within the church to try and guide us in a way forward. So we had a recalled National Indigenous Spiritual Gathering in November in Winnipeg. Beautiful time of year to go to Winnipeg if you haven't. And we did some initial sort of trying to sort things out, and everybody's not still happy, but I'm really proud of the elders, many of whom have been working at some of these changes for 40 or 50 years or more, for the role that they're playing in trying to hold things together. And so the hard part is being Indigenous and watching all of this happen, not having the authority to make decisions or to, uh, I have some influence, but um, I can't fix it the same way that I could when I was the executive director at First United.
Yeah.
Um, and also then getting like, we have some folks that in the church that tend towards thinking that they know the right answer. And so like having angry white people write to me and get mad at me for um the the inability to like have resolved this, and the fact that, just what they saw in the general council call was kind of, that was rough.
Right. So as I listen, first of all, thank you for that
Yeah.
explanation. I haven't heard anything that detailed and that clear about like how we seem to get into the space we've been in the last couple or 3 months. But it occurs to me as I'm listening to you that this puts you in a very, I don't know the word to use, awkward, difficult, vulnerable position as a very high profile Indigenous leader within the United Church, but moderator of the whole church. This must feel complicated and difficult, and by times, I mean, there's a wonderful opportunity here for you to bring a kind of a pastoral care to the church, but on the other hand, it must make you feel exposed often.
It's not too bad. I mean, generally the church's approach is that, when it comes to truth and reconciliation, or so-called Indian residential schools, we tend internally within the general council office, we refer to them as institutions rather than schools. Um, the policy of the church is that Indigenous people should not be called on to speak to the anybody in the church about reconciliation, that it's the work of non-Indigenous people to do that. And there have been times, because of my role in the office of moderator, that it's, there have been times when I felt free to say, no, I'm not going to talk about that. That's not actually my work. And so either the general secretary or other senior staff will do it. Our reconciliation animators are amazing. But then there are times like the first national gathering on unmarked burials where they were asking for senior leadership of the Roman Catholic, Anglican, and United Churches to come and respond to the proceedings of that first national gathering. And I just said, the general secretary is also the other senior staff leader. And my role is the one that is elected. And so in terms of the public role and in terms of the spiritual leadership of the church, it's more appropriate for me to go. And so even though I'm the granddaughter of a residential school survivor, I will go and speak on behalf of the church, because I know if there was any other person as moderator, they would go and do that, because that's how our church is living into its accountability for our past. And so that was rough, to go and to repeat back what I heard. And I just let myself cry in public and shared about being health sick first, being the granddaughter of a residential school survivor and the daughter of a 60 scoop survivor. And also, here's why I can still be Indigenous and Christian, is because of the United Church's rumbling with this hard history. And so, each circumstance requires its own discernment about, like, am I the right person and do I have to do this? And often the answer has been no, but sometimes it's yes.
Well, the challenges are obvious. I mean, they're particular to the United Church, and you've explained brilliantly just why they arose in the form that they've taken. But we thought for this conversation, it would be useful for us to bring in somebody who's had some experience with this challenge of building a space in an institution which is more appropriate for Indigenous people. And so we invited Parker MacCarthy. I mentioned before that he's a recently retired judge of the BC Provincial Court, but he's also a lifetime member of the United Church and currently a member of Duncan United Church in Duncan, BC. Parker, it's great to have you with us as well today. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So maybe before I ask you to reflect on some of the things Carmen has just shared with us, could you maybe talk about your own experience within the court system of doing something which at least sounds like there's an echo of what you did with what we're trying to do in the United Church?
Well, one of the things that occurred to me when Brian approached me about doing this was that I could speak to what I consider to be an innovative program which has been introduced by the Provincial Court of British Columbia, and it's what is referred to as our First Nations courts. And much well before the 2015 seminal report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, there was and it's 94 calls to action. There was a program that was introduced by then an Indigenous judge or headed by an Indigenous judge who sat in New Westminster, British Columbia, which is on the banks of the Fraser River and east of the city of Vancouver, and across the river from the fastest growing part of British Columbia, which is Surrey, British Columbia. And the Indigenous judge brought together a Crown prosecutor, probation officer, and other resources in order to create this church in New Westminster, or sorry, this court in New Westminster, which was called the New Westminster First Nations Court. It has spun off from that to the point where there are now a total of 10 First Nations courts in British Columbia, and they're situated in most of the regions of the province, including the interior and north. One was just recently established in Chilliwack, which is at the east end of the Fraser Valley. And each of these courts has been set up in consultation with local Indigenous communities and their leaders. The second First Nations court was established in Kamloops in May of 2013, and then 2 months later, the third was established in the Cowichan Valley, which is the home of Duncan, British Columbia, and it's been operating now for about 12 years. The Cowichan Valley is the ancestral home of the Cowichan tribes. It has a population of over 5,000 members, and it makes it the largest First Nation by membership number in British Columbia. And it has a very progressive and innovative band. And I lived here and practiced here for some 49 years, or lived here for 49 years. I practiced law for about 35, and then I have been, just until my recent retirement, I've been one of the two resident judges in the Duncan Courthouse. My friend and former colleague, judicial colleague, Judge Roger Cutler, presides over our First Nations court. And although I have not presided, I have attended First Nations court as an observer, and I have and as a result of my duties of working in the main criminal courts, I am very familiar with the operations of the First Nation courts in both locally as well as in other parts of the province. And the obviously what the First Nations courts are dealing with is the impact of intergenerational trauma arising from years of colonization, including the residential school system and 60 Scoop. And that, as we well know, has separated Indigenous people from their communities and their traditional culture and languages. So what the overview or of the operations of the First Nations Court was really designed to draw on the strength and the wisdom of the elders, and to look at ways of determining how the underlying causes that brought people before the criminal justice system can be dealt with in a culturally appropriate and sensitive way. So in each of these courts, there's a consistency of the same judge, same prosecutors, same duty counsel, native court workers, and then people who are characterized as client liaison workers. And each of the people who attend court are the nomenclature is clients. They are clients of that particular court. And what is being sought to do is to come up with what's called a healing plan for each of these individuals, which draws on a number of resources, and in particular the wisdom of the elders in helping to come up with a plan that's going to address everything from substance abuse issues, family violence, a whole host of barriers that a person may face if they have gone through the cycle, intergenerational cycles of that have been thrust upon them, of violence and things of that nature. So these healing plans are then used to create the conditions that a person may have imposed upon them by the judicial system. Now, mindful, these are sentencing courts; they are not trial courts. So people have accepted that they've accepted that they've committed a wrongdoing, and then they're going to be dealing with how they're going to improve themselves, and a lot of that is all focused on the use or by the assistance of the elders. In Duncan, for example, there's usually 4 elders at any sitting.
Okay, now, Parker, I'm sorry to interrupt here,
Yeah.
but and I'm like, it's breathtaking to me how complex these things are, right? And just sort of giving the basics of what's going on, whether it's within a church or within a court system, requires us to take some time to do that. And unfortunately, that's the thing we have the least of here today is time. But that gives us, I think, a really great sketch, not only of how it functions, but also some intimations about what it took to kind of put it in place in a way that was itself respectful. And led to its success. And so maybe I could ask in the couple of minutes we have between Carmen and Parker, Where do you think we need to go in the United Church to try and get ourselves in a space where things are working well, where we are listening to the wisdom of elders and others, where we are putting in place the structures for the United Church, which can lead us to a place which is more respectful, which is truly a reconciliatory process? Any thoughts about that, either Parker or Carmen?
Judge MacCarthy, you got 30 seconds. Tell us all the answers.
Well, the I mean, the reason that the First Nations courts work is because of a buy-in, I'll say, by local Indigenous communities and by their leadership, and I guess the use of the wisdom and the caring and the support provided by the elders is the key to their success. And I mean, the Supreme Court of Canada, just three members of the Supreme Court of Canada, plus our Chief Justice, including our Chief Justice, just met with the elders of the Cowichan elders to hear about their experience. So you need that kind of buy-in, you need that grassroots acceptance. That gives legitimacy to the process.
Yeah. Carmen, you've got your 30 seconds now.
Um, well, yeah, I think that that's exactly right. And I think that the fact that we didn't do that in the restructuring of the church is part of the reason why the Indigenous church is once again unsettled. Um, and I would also say the thing that I know must be true behind the infrastructure of those Indigenous courts is the resources to do that work, which I assume is not always, as fast paced as might move through other court systems, requires more consultation, collaboration, and that takes people hours, it takes financial dollars, and so I think that one of the things I argue for in my dissertation, which is coming out as a book this summer, is to really try and see the world as a place of abundance. And right now we have this narrative of decline in the church that, like people are scarcer, dollars are scarcer. But I don't think that that's the reality of the world that God created. And we have to find a way to start tapping into the abundance of the world and to say that there is enough for this church. Our resources in the church are very inequitably distributed across regions. They're distributed inequitably between rural and urban and between Indigenous and non-Indigenous churches or other racialized people and the white church. And so we have to be able to step into a time of creativity, listen to the wisdom of our elders, listen to the dreams of people like Francis Sandy and Jesse Soto and Stan Mackay and Sinadius Fiddler and all of those folks that started fighting for Indigenous justice in the church in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and trust that there is enough for us all to create ministries that can thrive and flourish in the 21st century in the United Church of Canada.
Moderator Parker, thanks for being with us today. What a pleasure it's been speaking with you.
My honor. Thank you.
Thank you.
And let's turn to Brian Arthur Brown, who is, of course, the guy who's responsible for these gatherings and this entire series, as well as his great book, The Untied Church. Brian, why don't you give us the wrap up and the look ahead for our last session next week?
Well, I'd like to begin by thanking my excellent colleague and friend. Carmen is responsible, as you said, for the foreword for my book, and she's a dear colleague. And that book has gone now to more than 5,000 congregations in print and to, well, a whole lot more than that in ebooks, and there are studies. Parker is one of the British Columbia Friends of the Foundation group that have been organizing congregations into clusters and so on. And his congregation at Duncan will be a part of that. But I'd like to say that in spite of all these concerns, one of the great strengths that we're finding in the face of all the difficulties that have been mentioned is the strength of congregations. And it's not universally so among the indigenous congregations, but it's widely so, that there's a great strength there. For example, I happen to know that this evening, this program is being watched by a group at Goodfish Lake United Church in Alberta, and with their minister having been on one of our previous programs and so on. And Goodfish Lake congregation is a host to a cluster. They're hosting the settler white congregations for a gathering to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the United Church, conscious of all the failures of the United Church 100 years ago to fully incorporate and recognize things as they should have been. But also it's a year now since the passing of the remit, and things haven't all worked out yet, but they're getting there. And it's congregations like Goodfish Lake where we find great strength. And across the church. This is not to decry the importance of the connectional link. It used to be Presbyterian Conference. It's now regional councils, and that's very important. And the celebrations in June of the National Church, a big service being live streamed across the country from from Gower Street United Church. But the defining characteristic of the 100th anniversary, in the opinion of some people, including a writer who's preparing something for the Broadview magazine, a defining characteristic is the participation of congregations in the celebration. And they're doing so mostly in clusters. In the 50th anniversary and in the 75th anniversary, there were no such congregational gatherings or clusters in particular, and so on. But this time around, in the 100th anniversary, the clusters, which were kind of envisaged in the restructuring of our church, but didn't get off the ground in too many places, they're beginning to get off the ground, and the clusters are gathering. There are more than 100 clusters now organized across the country. More will be organizing. We're gathering. We can't seem to get it stopped. We don't want to, and so on. But the Friends of the Foundation are a group that began in Woodlake Books, and the first clusters were Woodlake congregations that had Whole People of God curriculum and so on. But the whole thing has mushroomed. So next week, there will be some clustering emphasis as we look at how the last of our series of the Epiphany Study, how the clusters are functioning and what's going on, and how that relates to all the other things, Francophone studies and Indigenous studies, that we've done during this Epiphany season. So I think there will be, one of our panelists will be a representative from the United Church of Canada Foundation, and they're doing more and more in support of congregations and urging congregations to get set up with endowments and resolve some of the financial pressures on congregations and so on. And this is going to be launched for many congregations with a special offering in their cluster. But that's all to come next week, and I think everybody will enjoy seeing that. It's one of the happy good stories about the 100th anniversary, and there are others as well. So we'll see you all then.